Helen Keller, Courage in Darkness, by Emma Carlson Byrne. Chapter 3. Learning the World. A miracle has happened. The light of understanding has shone upon my little pupil's mind, and behold, all things are changed. By Annie Sullivan. Helen's guttural screams and crashings were easily heard from the open windows of the main house, and the Kellers were concerned. What was going on over there? One morning the captain peeked in the window and saw Helen still in her nightgown at 10 o'clock with her breakfast uneaten on the table. Apparently Annie would not let her eat breakfast until she got dressed. Filled with the worry, the captain raged to his wife that no daughter of his would be deprived of food. He threatened to send Annie home. Still, Annie must have sensed that her method would work because she did not let up. And on March 20th, just over 2 weeks after Annie's arrival, while they were still living in the annex, Annie wrote in a letter, "My heart is singing for joy this morning. A miracle has happened. The light of understanding has shone upon my little pupil's mind, and behold, all things are changed. The wild little creature of 2 weeks ago has been transformed into a gentle child." Helen let Annie kiss her now and sat beside her, crocheting and doing beadwork. Just what was this miracle, Annie never says specifically, but perhaps Helen finally realized that Annie could teach her many wonderful things if she would only pay attention. Perhaps Annie's stronger will simply conquered Helen's, and Helen decided it was easier to love than fight. One of Helen's biographers suggested that Annie found a way of cutting off Helen's growing source of communication, her hands, perhaps by trying and refusing to spell to Helen when she misbehaved. Helen alluded to this later in her writing, though it is not known if Annie used or discovered this method during the days in the annex. Now that Helen's behavior was under control, both Annie and Helen could turn their attention to their true task, learning language. Helen already knew many different words and could spell them into Annie and understand when they were supposed to be spelled. However, she mixed up words a lot. For instance, Helen knew that she knew the words mug and milk meant something to drink, but she would make a pouring motion when she spelled mug, and she would misspell milk when pointing to the mug. Annie wrote in a letter that Helen had no idea yet that everything has a name. In other words, Helen did not understand the greater purpose of languages, that words could be used to communicate all sorts of thoughts, from identifying a simple object, such as a cup, to expressing a feeling of action, such as thirst or drinking. All of that would soon change, though. The Awakening. By early April in 1887, Annie and Helen returned to the main house and were still wrestling with language problems. Then one morning on the 5th of April, while washing up, Helen indicated to Annie that she wanted to know what this cool, wet liquid was that flowed over her hand. Annie spelled water into Helen's hand, but it was obvious to Annie that a key connection was still missing from Helen's mind. She still did not understand that the manual language gestures Annie was constantly performing in Helen's hands had a meaning, and the specific hand movements Annie was now using on her pupil's palm meant water. To Helen, those hand gestures had no purpose. They were just finger games to mimic and copy back to Annie. Then an idea occurred to Annie. Maybe Helen's desire to know the name for water could help Helen. The pair went out into the bright southern sunshine, and Helen skipped ahead of Annie to the pump house, where the pump was kept. There, Annie and Helen held her cup under the water while Annie pumped at the same time, spelled water into Helen's hand. More pumping, and then water again. Something about the cold water flowing over her hand and the spelling at the same time turned on a switch in Helen's mind. She got it. As Annie wrote later, she said that she has learned that everything has a name, and that the manual alphabet is the key to learning everything she wants to know. Helen's face was filled with wonder and joy. She spelled water to Annie several times, and then started asking for names of the other objects, the ground, a trellis, the pump, and then she touched Annie and mentioned. Annie spelled teacher. At last Helen understood that Annie had a name too. All the way back to the house, Helen asked Annie to name objects, revealing in her new world. Within a few hours, Helen added 30 new words to her vocabulary. Many historians believe that morning at the pump marked the emergence of Helen's personality. Helen was naturally bright, and for most of her previous life was inexpressibly and not being able to communicate. Annie opened the door and gave Helen the ability to express herself through language, revealing Helen's curious, delightful nature. After the morning at the pump, Helen progressed incredibly fast. She was so busy absorbing knowledge, she did not have time to misbehave. Soon she was learning not only nouns, but also verbs, adjectives, abstract thoughts, and simple sentences. Of course, Helen's personality was not completely transformed. She was still willful and could occasionally lapse into her own behavior. Now, though, Helen understood that her actions had consequences. When Helen bit and scratched Vinnie, the little daughter of one of the Keller's servants, Annie communicated to Helen that she was very sad at her behavior. Helen was very upset, and after a whole day of sadness, she went to Vinnie and apologized by letting Vinnie kiss her. Living and learning. Helen hardly realized she was doing work. In fact, because of Annie's style of teaching, Helen thought that learning was the most fun thing she had ever done. Annie was a self-taught teacher. No one had told her that there was a certain way to teach or for students to learn. She taught Helen in the way she thought best. One day, Helen's little cousin came to visit the Kellers with her parents. Annie watched the way the adults interacted with the 15-month-old, who was just learning language. People spoke to the child in full sentences using figures of speech, abstract thoughts, and adjectives even though the child could not understand everything that was being said to her. Annie realized that the child would eventually simply absorb the rhythms and patterns of speech naturally and would figure out the meanings of different words and parts of speech, partly by herself. She decided to employ the same method with Helen. Every day, all day long, Annie used the manual alphabet to convey ordinary language to Helen, whether or not Helen could understand everything she was trying to communicate. Annie and Helen studied and learned all through the hot Alabama summer. The pair would leave the main house and roam the fields of ivy green, the river, and the barnyard. They would climb trees and examine rocks, flowers, and insects, and all the time Annie would pour conversation, explanation, and description into Helen's hand. The method worked. Helen was entranced. Annie could not spell fast enough to keep up with Helen's questions. Helen wanted to communicate and learn all day as if she was making up for all the time lost. At night, Helen would spell in her sleep. By June 1887, Helen knew 400 words. Annie wrote that she had been transformed from a wild child to one who insisted on having her hair put up in curl papers every night. Annie taught Helen to read Braille, the raised dot system for blind people. And Helen began devouring books, as she would for the rest of her life. Soon, Helen was reading poems by popular American poets Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Oliver Wendell Holmes. The Kellers were excited by Helen's progress and eager to spell to her. However, Annie was very possessive of her change, a pattern that would continue for the rest of Annie's own life. For instance, she would not permit Kate to hire a nurse to help care for Helen, telling Kate that she wanted no one interfering with her interactions with Helen. Annie was even resented Kate's attempt to learn the manual alphabet to talk to her daughter. She told Kate that she, Annie, was going to be the only one to teach Helen words. Annie may not have been perfect, but she had transformed not only Helen's life, but also the entire Keller family. Christmas 1887 was a reverent and thankful time, Annie wrote. It was evident that everyone, especially Captain and Mrs. Keller, was deeply moved at the thought of the difference between this Christmas and the last. As we came downstairs, Mrs. Keller said to me with tears in her eyes, "Miss Annie, I thank God every day of my life for sending you to us, but I never realized until this morning what a blessing you have been to us. For Helen, life would have never been the same."